Hi, and welcome to the fifth in the series of realistic business forecasting podcasts. I decided to take a bit of a different approach in this one. What I'm going to do is I'm going to look at two case studies, the Channel Tunnel and Irish Railways, and look at how the forecasts were done, the problems of the forecasting, and perhaps what lessons can be learned. Now, what I've decided to do, I have elected to call this particular podcast Common Sense. And there were various titles I could have had, but I wanted something which was snappy, to the point. And you can see that in the second case study in particular, perhaps common sense was a little bit lacking, but you can make up your own minds on that. But let's start with the big one, which is the Channel Tunnel. Now, as you can imagine, the Channel Tunnel, being the huge project that it was forecast to death by many organisations. So let's actually have a look at how well they did. The audit is a particularly important part of forecasting, and whilst for something like Channel Tunnel, obviously there are no lessons to be learned for forecasting a future Channel Tunnel, because there isn't going to be one. If you are in the business of making regular forecasts in the business, actually understanding where your forecast went wrong will help you with future forecasts. But let's crack on. Now, the first problem is defining what is the market. And I've defined here two markets, the narrow market and the maximum market. Let's look at the narrow market first. So what the narrow market includes is air travel between London and Paris and London and Brussels, which were the two destinations which the Eurostar service started serving. And it includes short ferries, which are between the Kent coast and the northern coast of France and Ostend. And of course, Eurostar itself and the Channel Shuttle. Now, you can see from this that there was quite healthy growth prior to the Channel Tunnel opening in November 1994. So one question which could be asked, but we won't go any further with it, is how much of the growth after 1994, when the tunnel did open, was attributable to the tunnel itself, and how much was attributable to secular growth in demand? We don't know. It's very difficult to disentangle those, but I just thought it was worth pointing that out. And you can see that under the narrow market definition, the market did expand considerably for about 3-4 years. And then towards the end of this particular time frame, which is 1999, growth actually stalled. Now, what I've shown here in summary is the share for each of the modes up to 2018. And unsurprisingly, rail has come to dominate. Ferries have declined. And there's a stubborn 8 to 9% of air travel. This is, I guess, people who are either transiting in London or Paris on the way to the other city, or people who live quite close to airports like Gatwick, City, Heathrow, or Stansted, for whom air would remain more convenient than rail. Now let's look at the maximum market size. For the maximum market size, I've effectively thrown everything but the kitchen sink into this. It includes all air travel between the UK and Belgium, Germany, France, Netherlands, Luxembourg. And it includes all ferries between the UK and France, Netherlands, and Germany. And you can see that in 1989, the maximum market was pretty much double the size of the narrow market. Now let's actually have a look at some of these forecasts, and some of the forecasts were quite old. The red ones date from 1982, the blue ones date from 1990, and the black figures actually show what happened in 3 selected years. Now, if you actually look at the combined rail volume, which is Eurostar and Shuttle, you can see that the forecasts were actually not too bad. You could argue that the rail demand projected in 1990 for 2003, that was somewhat excessive, 25 million. But the big difference is between actual market size and projected market size. So it's, again, we come back to this issue about how the total is defined. So the main point I want to raise on this slide, I've covered the first 2 points briefly on the previous slide, is what actually happens when a new competitor enters a market. A new competitor will take demand from current players, incumbents. That invariably happens if the product is decent. But what also happens is the overall market size will increase. Now, why does this actually happen? This occurs because the incumbents need to work harder to retain their demand or try and minimize reduction in demand. That forces them to be more efficient, be more attractive to consumers, and hence generate demand in that way. Prices will be lower as another competitor enters the market as well. And this also occurred in Germany when the German government deregulated long-distance bus travel. Not only did long-distance bus travel mushroom in a couple of years, but rail travel, which was the only public monopoly at the time, the only public transport monopoly, also showed some growth. So the overall market did expand significantly because the German railways had to work harder before. They didn't have to work too much because there's of course a case of use our trains or don't travel if you didn't have a car. But now they had competition, they had to work much harder to try and attract people. Now let's actually look what happened with what was the first high-speed service in Europe, which was between Paris and Lyon. And that opened in 1981. So we can see that what happened was that if you look at rail and air combined, the market grew from about 2.9 million to 4.5 million. So that's a growth of 55% in 5 years. And again, unsurprisingly, the rail share shot up from about 50% to over 80%. Now, the reason I've actually shown this is to actually see what happens to market size when there's a major change in the supply of services, in this case, high-speed train, the TGV. So let's actually look at what's happened with market size using the narrow market definition on the Channel Tunnel. You can see that the market size growth was remarkably similar to Paris-Lyon, although this obviously is over a longer period of 30 years rather than 5 years. By contrast, if we look at the maximum market size, then the growth is much larger. But, and this is a big but, you can see that most of the growth occurred in air travel. And that happened because of deregulation of air transport in the UK and Europe in 1995 and 1997 respectively. Now, when the forecasts were done in 1990, there is no way that the forecasters could envisage that this was going to happen because it was quite a long way into the future. So you need to be a little bit careful here because the 90% market size growth is not attributable to the Channel Tunnel. So all this information I've presented does beg some questions, I think, and I've highlighted the particular forecast, which is the 1990 forecast for the year 2003. So the large market, let's be generous and assume that Eurostar were using the maximum market as their market size. And in 1989, the market size was just over 40 million. So where were all these extra trips coming from? If it wasn't from extra air travel, which, as I said, it was not a thing in 1990, where did they think that all this extra traffic was going to come from? In effect, more than doubling the size of the market in 13 years, just because you open a tunnel between Folkestone and Calais. It just strikes me as being somewhat implausible, really. And the second related question is that given that air travel would probably stay the same or just grow a little bit, given there were no assumptions at the time about airline deregulation, why did the ferries receive such a large boost? If you actually look at the numbers, you'll see that the size of demand for ferries would have increased significantly to make this 107 million annual journeys in 2003. So to me, it strains credibility. And this is why I labeled this particular podcast Common Sense, because I feel that nobody actually stood back and looked around and thought, okay, this is what our models are telling us, but does it make sense? And personally, I'm not convinced it does. Okay, that's enough about the Channel Tunnel. Let's go on to a rather simpler case. And for me, this one is much more amusing. In 2009 to 2011, Irish Railways, with the help of consultants, undertook a strategy review, and part of the strategy review was a forecast of demand. Now, they used quite a simple model, and the demand was a function of gross national product per person, which is generally acknowledged to be an important factor. But that was the only factor that they used. Now, we will look at this issue of R squared in more detail in a future podcast. I believe it's going to be the next podcast. But what this is telling us is that 84% of the variation in railway demand is attributable to variation in gross national product per person. And that is a credible result. So let's actually have a look at how the model and real data actually compare. And if we look at the top half, you can see that the fit is generally pretty good, which is what the 84% R squared tells us. But if we look at the error term, again, this is something we will be looking at in significant detail in future. You can see that for the first 6 or 7 years, the error was pretty low. But as you move on from 1997, the error terms are getting larger and larger. And that should be a red flag. Now, what I actually did using their model, I actually compared what the model said with the actual number of journeys which were seen on the railways for 5 years after the model finished. The model's last year was 2009. And you can see here that the error, the difference between actual and modeled, increased significantly year on year. And by 2014, there was actually a 20% error. Be careful here that I'm using that my y-axis starts at 7, which is why the actual model do look much larger. But nonetheless, a 18% error is quite large. And the fact that the errors were getting bigger from one year to the next is definitely a worry. So what went wrong? Well, here's a clue. the Irish government embarked on a major motorway building scheme. And you can see that in 2008, there was not much in the way of motorways, just over 400 kilometres. 6 years later, the number of kilometres of motorway had almost tripled. And my reaction to this was, did the people doing the work not actually look out of the window, so to speak, and actually see what was happening in the big wide world? Because you would expect the development of a motorway network, and especially such significant growth over 6 years, to have a significant impact on rail demand. And as we can see in the previous slide, it did. So what can we take away from these two examples? I think the important first one is just step back from number crunching and actually see what's actually happening. Is what I'm saying realistic? Have I really considered all the really important factors? And in the second example, motorway construction was obviously an important issue which the modelers just did not consider. The second one is this issue about defining a market. It is not always easy to define a market. But what I've tried to do here is I've shown you a minimum, a realistic minimum and a realistic maximum for market size. The third one is, what does common sense tell us about relationships? Now, in addition to the motorway issue for Irish Railways, perhaps the modelers should have looked at car ownership. Car ownership does make a significant difference to demand for public transport, which again, I suspect won't come as any great surprise. But it's something which was not mentioned at all in the report, the link from the link I provided earlier. And finally, something I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast was, especially if you are undertaking regular forecasts for an ongoing business, you should actually audit the outcome of a model. It's called ex post evaluation. And it should be a regular part of the forecasting process. Where did we go wrong? How can we improve our forecast for the next time we do the exercise? These are issues I've covered before, but they are so important, I feel it is worth mentioning them again. Anyway, that's all I have for today. I do hope that was useful, those two examples. What I'm going to do in the next podcast is I'm actually going to tackle a subject called regression, which is looking in more detail at relationships, but in this particular case, it's how one or more variables influence another. Whereas correlation was not looking at cause and effect, we will be looking at causation next. And I'll be showing you the sorts of things you need to consider when developing a model, which will then be used for forecasting, which we will come on to eventually, but actually understanding historic data is critical to being able to undertake a good forecast. So I hope that's all been useful and helpful. Thank you for your attention, and I'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.